Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin. Danny Lennon, we're just talking off air about the fact you're coming up on almost 12 years for Sigma Nutrition Radio. I mean, this is one of the podcasts, one of the first couple of podcasts I ever listened to. Was a major inspiration for starting this podcast 8 years ago and how I have gone about it. It's one of the most influential, piece of media, plus you yourself. And I mean, your background is insane. A master's degree in nutritional science. You're on a variety of advisory boards, including the Sports Nutrition Association, foodfacts.org. Again, the host of the long-running and iconic podcast, Sigma Nutrition Radio. And you're the co-author of Making Weight, the Ultimate Science-Based Guide to Cutting Weight for Combat Sports, which is pretty awesome. It's great to have you back. It's been a long time.
Well, thank you for having me back. It's an honor and a pleasure to be back, and even more so for the very kind words that you said. I really do appreciate them, and it's really nice to hear, especially given the work that you've done and that you continue to do, that in some way in the past, Sigma Nutrition was able to play a role in some of that interest. So thank you for the kind words. Yeah, it's great to be here.
Well, we got to honor you by bringing you on here, but at the same time, we're going to talk some nutrition stuff. So, the first question, how does it feel to be one of the most measured and evidence-based authorities on nutrition, even as unqualified influencers share loud nonsense opinions on social media?
Well, I'm not sure the best way to answer that. I think these days I try to stick more to just what I want to do and what we want to do at Sigma Nutrition in terms of the podcast we put out, the things that we want to talk about, and try and, as much as is possible, keep myself away from having to consume too much of what is out there, because I'm aware of the stuff that goes around the internet, but it is at a level where if I were to try and consume more and keep up to date with all the craziness that's out there, I would probably just get frustrated all the time. So my way of keeping sane is to try and play our small little role of what we try to do with the podcast of, can we look at the studies and talk to different researchers and relay that to people who want evidence-based information, while at the same time, from time to time, we do have to, of course, address many of the big claims that are out there, some of which I'm sure we will get into today. But yeah, I tend not to maybe think of myself as particularly evidence-based or particularly measured, just because most of the people who I try to interact with or who I respect, that is kind of like the norm. And so I just try and do the things and operate in a way that I think is ethical and objective and useful to people. And so yeah, I don't think I'm particularly virtuous in any way, but that's just the way I try and do it.
A humble and measured answer. Does it at the very least galvanize you into say the mission, the purpose is important and has helped keep you on course for this long? Again, because you were one of the first people who was creating this kind of informational platform.
You know what? I'm not sure. I think from a rational perspective, I can see that there's value in that, because I mean, more than ever, perhaps we need more sane voices out there that give objective information that is actually going to be useful to people, that is not just trying to scam them or sell them into some either product or ideology. And so I see the utility in trying to put out evidence-based information, but a lot of the time I get quite pessimistic about the direction that things have been going. And I think more and more of that pessimism creeps in just because of how much there is to try and counteract for a variety of things that are happening within our society. And I think that will continue just in terms of how people consume information, where they turn to for information, all the stuff now that's going on with generation of content via AI, and how we think of what experts in different domains actually are. All these things are kind of coalescing together, that I think it just becomes almost impossible for many people in the general population, even with the intention of seeking out information on a particular topic, to get the right information. And so I think I try not to go too too down the pessimistic road too often, because very quickly you might end up saying, well, I'm just going to give up. But at the same time, I try and balance it out with, like I said, that rational part that says, well, we still need more sane voices out there, because there are genuinely people interested in looking for that type of information. And so that's the way I try and evaluate it.
This episode is brought to you by Just Bite Me Meals. I work long days and I won't compromise my client experience or sacrifice my workout, sleep, or nutrition. So I needed a quality and reliable meal prep service so I could save time on cooking and shopping and have more time for the stuff that matters. Net out the cost of groceries, and the service isn't as much as you might think, and regular impulsive food delivery apps, eating out, that costs way more anyway. I get more meal variety and less dishes to clean, and I've been referring clients to Just Bite Me Meals for a long time, and I recently started ordering myself. Food is great. The beef brisket tacos are my favorite so far, and there's a lot of menu choice. Your calories and macros are listed. The portions are great. You can order custom meals. They deliver to your door, or you can pick up from their storefront. And I'm sorry to listeners outside of Alberta, but Just Bite Me Meals is currently just in Edmonton, Calgary, Grand Prairie, and Fort McMurray. Ordering from Just Bite Me Meals made my life easier instantly. And you can get 10% off on all your orders using my code, Andrew Coates Fitness, all caps, on their website. That's Andrew Coates Fitness, all capitals, or go to the link and the code in the show notes. I tend to think of our work as, we hope that the right people will self-select and plug in. And sometimes it feels like we're already speaking to the choir with this. I also think your answer, all the coaches listening, because I bet you every one of us is felt what you just said, and like, oh, sometimes it feels like we're not changing anything, but that's why I'm still here too, right? I believe in this stuff. Okay, let's do the big dirty thing that I haven't touched on the podcast before. And there are going to be some people, I know there are going to be listeners who've got a really deeply rooted, emotionally held belief system on seed oils. Okay. Are seed oils the cause of all of the Western world's health problems?
In short, we can probably say no, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of this in a bit for some of the reasons behind that. But I think it's worth acknowledging, like you said, that there's obviously very strong positions that many people have, and I do have a significant degree of sympathy for people who come across information that to some degree makes sense. It has a nice narrative behind it. There's people who are very convincing with what they say. And it also fits in with a whole host of narratives that kind of conveniently make it sound like it should be true. So, for example, I would in no way defend many of the actions of certain actors within the food industry. And I have no doubt that the food industry in general is trying to sell us products and doesn't really care about our health. And so I wouldn't negate that. But alongside then understanding that, we get some of this thing of, well, everything to do with seed oils is down to this idea that we're just trying to, we don't care about people's health. We're trying to maximize profit through these. And so we're intentionally lying to try and get people away from other types of food. So I can understand how this comes in. However, it's one of the real interesting topics because obviously it's caught a lot of people's attention. It's probably one of the most talked about right now. But when you actually go and look at the evidence we have in humans, looking at the consumption of products that have, let's say, whether they're using terminology seed oils, or typically when people are talking about the seed oils, the components that they are saying are potentially negative is the linoleic acid content or the amount of polyunsaturated fat or PUFA or the omega-6. All these are kind of interrelated terms. But when we go and look at the literature in humans, we can see across really tightly controlled trials, we can see in large epidemiology studies, looking at actual human consumption of these in different amounts, we don't see the negative outcomes that people would suspect, given all the things that we're hearing of, that seed oils are driving inflammation, and once we're consuming them or we're using them in cooking and so on, this is driving inflammation, in turn is causing all these outcomes or these negative outcomes that we can talk to. However, once we look through the literature, you just don't see that. In fact, one of the interesting things, and maybe the most surprising for a lot of people, is that if you do take these typical types of oils, let's say that are high linoleic acid, high polyunsaturated fat oils, in situations where you replace saturated fat with these types of oils, you see positive health outcomes rather than negative. And this is just one of the most replicable things across all of nutrition science, that you take out saturated fat and you increase polyunsaturated fat. That has the greatest lipid lowering effect, i.e., that it decreases someone's LDL cholesterol by more than any other substitution that we can make. And when you decrease someone's LDL cholesterol over the long term, that leads to reductions in atherosclerosis development, reductions in their cardiovascular disease risk. And this is just seen over and over and over again. And so I think where there's maybe some part of the confusion is that, of course, in many highly processed products and ones that maybe people overconsume and that we would generally think of as these ultra processed or quote unquote junk foods, of course, in many of those products, they would use different types of oils in part of that formulation. But those health effects are not down to the fact that they used safflower oil or sunflower oil instead of using beef tallow in the formulation of these potato chips, right? So that's not the thing that's going on. So that's a bit of stuff all over the place, but we can take any part of that you think would be useful. But I think in short, I think the easiest way for people to look at this is, where do we find any human outcome data where someone is increasing their intake of, let's say, polyunsaturated fats or some of these seed or vegetable oils and see negative health outcomes? It just isn't there.
All right, let's backpedal a little. Can we define exactly what seed oils are? You mentioned safflower oil, sunflower oil, because I'm wondering if most of the people who are the loudest about seed oils being the devil even know what the hell they're talking about, or are they lumping in other things like every type of vegetable or cooking oil out there?
Right. So, and really, this isn't the strict term that you're going to go and find in most of the research papers, because the term seed oil, as we commonly talk about now, is really more of a colloquial terminology that people are referring to. But essentially, you can take any of these vegetable or seed oils, typically people put together, right? So soybean, corn oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, these types of oils that are used from, as the name implies, these different types of seeds or from vegetable origin, are the ones that tend to fall under this umbrella group. And so by nature, most of them tend to have a relatively high degree of polyunsaturated fat. So when you look at their fat content, it varies by the type of oil that we're particularly looking at, but it varies up and down. But in general, they can confer a decent amount of polyunsaturated fat, or the kind of, again, people might hear the term PUFA, which is just a shortened acronym for that. And then within that, some of those claims, a particular type of polyunsaturated fatty acid is one of the omega-6 fatty acids, is linoleic acid. And sometimes people might hear claims that more specifically talk about linoleic acid being harmful as opposed to some of the other terms that we've just mentioned. So in general, we're thinking about those types of things: soybean, canola oil, sunflower oil, and so on. So these types of cooking oils that people will see in their supermarkets or in different products that are readily available, tend to be what we're referring to here. And then part of the counterclaim is that because of that, we should be going towards other types of more quote, quote stable oils that maybe are higher in saturated fat. So maybe cooking with butter or beef tallow or whatever the case may be.
Is, based on all the research you talked about a moment ago, do you think a big component of this is we're just replacing the saturated fat content, which more and more, and this has come up in numerous recent episodes, that there's a very strong relationship with, increasing consumption of saturated fat and worsening cardiovascular disease outcomes?
Yeah, and that's the large difference that we see here, that one of the principal driver of, or one of the main things going on here is when someone has an elevated LDL cholesterol concentration, or if we wanted to be more specific, we might say even a better predictor would be the amount of ApoB containing lipoproteins they have. But we can also go with LDL cholesterol. If someone has a high LDL cholesterol burden over a long period of time across their life, this is playing a causal role in driving atherosclerosis development. And so the longer and higher someone has their LDL cholesterol, that's increasing their risk of cardiovascular disease, and specifically atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease over their lifetime. Now, there's a number of different factors of play, of course, here, but from a dietary perspective, the strongest driver of increasing someone's LDL cholesterol is something that we call the P to S ratio, which is just the ratio of polyunsaturated to saturated fat. So by this, we mean that if someone has a very high intake of saturated fat relative to a lower intake of polyunsaturated fat, that would increase LDL cholesterol. Conversely, the greatest lipid lowering effect we could have if someone does have high LDL cholesterol would be swapping out some saturated fat for polyunsaturated fat. And so that would decrease their LDL cholesterol by more than other changes we might make. So specifically, just taking down their saturated fat intake would probably have an effect, but we would get a greater reduction in their LDL cholesterol if it was replaced by polyunsaturated fat compared to, let's say, monounsaturated fat. That would also decrease it, but by not as much. Similarly, with complex carbohydrate, we would probably see a reduction, but not as much. Now, interestingly, the same thing, if someone was to reduce their saturated fat intake, but replace all of those calories just with free sugars, for example, then we actually don't see a risk reduction, unsurprisingly, in their long-term health, because we're replacing one nutrient for another that's going to have a deleterious effect. So that is all to say that the greatest LDL cholesterol reduction is from increasing polyunsaturated fat or replacing the saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, and that's really what we can do. And one of the sources of that would be some of these vegetable oils. Now, that's not to say people need to go and start drinking these by the gallon. That's not the recommendation that's in place, but rather that limiting the typical source of saturated fat we have in the diet, and where we are getting dietary fat, we would tend to lean more on the unsaturated sources of those. And so there's a whole host of options that we have there. And one of those things would be to include those that have a decent amount of polyunsaturated fat.
Is because you mentioned that these trials, these studies that you're referring to are tightly controlled. Do you think that part of the actual issue here is just the overconsumption of calories because, oils and whatnot? There's just too much of this stuff in diets. Is that part of the problem?
In general, one particular issue, aside from what we've discussed here, is generally just overconsumption of calories across the board. We know that dietary patterns that people have that lead to an overconsumption of calories can play a role here. Obviously, any type of oil could be a part of that because it is a very calorie dense type of product, because for a very small amount, we're getting a significant amount of calories. And that is to say the same thing if we're having a huge amount of a calorie burden in the diet from whatever source, that could be a potential issue. However, I don't think that explains much of the hype or hysteria around seed oil. It seems to be quite distinct that it comes from certain places. And I think to be fair, probably in the past, there was some decent reason that people could come up with hypotheses that it could be potentially an issue. So earlier on, there was hypotheses about the inflammation thing, because we might have seen in mechanistic studies that if you have some of these oils, they might be more prone to oxidation. And we can look at these in a Petri dish, or we could look at certain animal models, and we might see something that indicates there could be an issue with high amounts of these. Or even from a mechanistic perspective, we know that some of the omega-6 could be competing with omega-3 to get into some of the cell. And so we can have all these different types of hypotheses that initially were there. But the important thing that we do within science, and particularly when we're trying to make decisions around our health, is to say, okay, here's our initial hypotheses that these could be causing problems. Now let's go and look at the effect of this in human trial data. We can look at randomized controlled trials. We can also look at the epidemiology of people who consume more or less of these types of products and see what their long-term health does. And we can look at these different lines of evidence and see what happens. And when we look at the actual outcome data in humans, which is what matters, we just don't see these negative effects that we could potentially have hypothesized before based on, let's say, the mechanistic chain of more linoleic acid leading to inflammation. So that's one that people could talk about, right? If you consume linoleic acid, we know that can be converted into something called arachidonic acid. And if some people have a high amount of arachidonic acid in tissues, we actually can see that can cause health problems and lead to higher degrees of inflammation as example. There's the causal chain there. However, we can go and then investigate that when there's indeed studies that you can look on this. You give people way more linoleic acid. You can give them 5-6 times their typical intake of linoleic acid, and it doesn't lead to an accumulation of arachidonic acid in tissue. It doesn't lead to increases in markers of inflammation like CRP1 or interleukin 6, all these different markers that we have. And so what we originally started with, this hypothesized mechanistic chain, doesn't play out in humans when we're consuming them via the diet. And so that should supersede any of this kind of mechanistic reason we could have initially started with to presume maybe there could be an issue with some of these types of oils or components of them like linoleic acid.
And you alluded to this, that the belief around seed oils being harmful, it's taken on something bigger. I mean, it's rooted in socio-ideological stuff now. It's part of that kind of battle. And that stuff tends to be not particularly grounded in evidence and more in belief and, socio-political, socio-ideological positions. Where did do you have any insight as to why seed oils became this contentious thing, this symbol of socio-political battles?
I think there's a few things going on. Like I think I alluded to at the start. One is that there have been people who have popularized maybe some of the quote unquote harms of seed oils, who have written books maybe or in popular media around this. And much of the discussion around it fits in with a similar type of narrative they would have with other aspects of diet and health. And so if someone is more prone to see some truth in some of those narratives, and there is some, which I'll get to, they might be more prone to thinking, okay, this seed oil thing is also true. So for example, much of that narrative ends up being that from an evolutionary perspective, we wouldn't have had seed oils. That's absolutely correct. Then along comes industrialization. Now we get this new product, these industrial seed oils that can be used now in our diet. Again, this is true. Then we now see that there's the role, obviously, of industry that wants to sell a lot of this product, and it's cheap to make, it's cheap put out in the food supply. And then there's this kind of leap to saying, now we're going to see nefarious things going on, as they also say about the dietary guidelines. Again, this is another area where much of the narrative is just completely divorced from reality. But the idea that all the guidelines were completely corrupt, that they were just set up to try and get us to eat more sugar and to stay away from saturated fat. And part of that narrative now they're building in the seed oils things, it was to push us away from quote unquote healthy things like butter or saturated fat sources. And so along comes these kind of compelling narratives. And so if we already do have some distrust of the food industry, or maybe some of these cases where there has been something maybe a bit nefarious going on in certain situations, now maybe it's much more likely we're going to take on and say, well, this is definitely the case here. Seed oils are being promoted just to either make money or to make us sick because the guidelines want to keep us sick, and they don't care about us taking control of our health or whatever the narrative might be. And so I think it ticks a lot of boxes in different areas. I'm not sure if that's probably not the case for everyone, but I think there's certain people that are proponents of these types of ideas that certainly try and kind of rewrite history to that type of degree, that was the reason for their introduction and the harms that they're having.
Makes a lot of sense. I find, in what I've observed, I get the sense that a lot of the people who share, promote, and sometimes it's just sharing social media stuff from the loudest voices that demonize seed oils, but it seems like, I don't want to mischaracterize anybody, but I believe it's often just part of the downloaded tribal belief system of certain corners of, again, socio-political, socio-demographic, or social ideological stuff. And I think a lot of these people don't question it. They just take it as part of the downloaded set of beliefs and narratives. And you can almost predict what some of those other beliefs and about the world are going to be. And I think just people just don't even question. And they may not even know. It's why I asked what, in fact, were seed oils. And I also want to ask, like, where do olive oil and avocado oil fit into this? Because I don't believe I've ever heard anybody refer to those two under that umbrella. And is the data that you said about the polyunsaturated fat content the same with, because olive oil is generally considered to be fairly healthy, although you occasionally get people who question, whether it's authentically good or, if it's gone bad, where it's sourced from, etc.
Right. So that's a good example. So olive oil doesn't tend to come in under this umbrella of seed oils. And so much of those that would be, let's say, in that anti-seed oil position wouldn't be debating points based on the health outcome data we have for olive oil that, as you mentioned, across the board tends to be very positive in general. Although it's interesting that it does tend to have some degree of a health halo compared to other oils, which is interesting, right? And obviously there are positive health outcomes from people consuming olive oil because of it's got polyphenol content, it's got a high degree of monounsaturated fats, and so it can be useful in contexts when people are including it in the diet. But to think that it is in all cases just better than every other oil, or there's not benefits to be had from using others, maybe is not well placed. But certainly, all in all, I think it does seem to have positive effects. But as with any question in nutrition, we can't really say any one food on its own is positive or negative. The question we have to ask is compared to what? And then layered on top of that, we have to think of what is someone's baseline diet and what is their overall dietary pattern. So those are the three things that people should evaluate any food or any nutrient, whether that's olive oil or anything else they can think of, is whether I want to say, is this food good or bad? I first have to say, what is someone's overall dietary pattern? What are they currently consuming compared to what they're thinking about changing to? And when I'm saying, is this food good or bad? I'm asking, is it compared to what? Because depending on that comparison, we could have a food have a positive impact on health, a neutral impact, or a negative impact. In fact, we see lots of situations of this in nutrition where there seems to be confusion of people saying, well, one week a study comes out saying this food is good for me, the next week it's bad for me. When you look at most of those studies, you see that a different comparator food was used in different trials and depending on the type of study design we're talking about, but always we need to be compared to what. And the reason why we do this simply is because when we're matching two different conditions, we need to make sure that the total energy is the same to make it a fair comparison. And so if I take out one food or I add in one particular food or a nutrient, something else has to come in or out of the comparison. And so that's always what we're talking about here. And so generally, that's if we're evaluating a nutrient or food, what are we comparing it to? And we can make some of these decisions based on that right now. And this is perfectly fits in what we're talking about: saturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, how much to consume, what food to consume. We would do it in that context of what are we replacing it with, and what is the total amount we have within the diet, if that makes sense.
Makes tons of sense. Now, you mentioned omega-6 a bunch, so that was the next progression of the questions, because we're often told we need omega-3, 6, to a lesser degree, omega-9s. And certainly omega-3s have anti-inflammatory properties, other health benefits. There's certainly, if I'm not mistaken, good, or at least strong, solid evidence that they're good for heart health and brain health, brain function. I would definitely love for you to talk about any of that evidence. And then we also often hear that omega-6 causes inflammation. So that's sort of the mechanistic thing that you referred to earlier. And there are some people that claim we need to limit omega-6. Do you want to give that a good treatment?
Sure. So very briefly, the first part of your question around omega-3s. Again, this is an interesting area of nutrition science because depending on where you look, some people might claim that omega-3s have a huge benefit. Other people saying there's no real impact. Oftentimes we're talking about supplementation. But what we can say is that if we go back to some of the early observational data here, we start to see that higher consumption of some of those fatty fish, like salmon, for example, or mackerel, were kind of correlated with some positive health outcomes, lower rates of cardiovascular disease. This kind of prompted some more research into, well, what is the component of this that we're seeing these beneficial outcomes, likely being something to do with omega-3. Hence, we started to get all this research onto omega-3. And indeed, we continue to see that type of pattern, that dietary patterns that have more omega-3 compared to less in the diet tend to have positive health outcomes, particularly when we're talking about cardiovascular disease. And we also have different markers that look at this. One is the omega-3 index. And depending on who you talk to, some people have more or less faith in this. But in general, we see that people who have a very low omega-3 index, let's say less than 4%, it's scored on a percentage scale. So less than 4% are associated with negative outcomes related to cardiovascular health. Some people make recommendations to get that between 8 to 12%. But what we definitely see is that once it gets low towards that kind of 4%, we're seeing negative health outcomes. So that would suggest that when we're consuming omega-3s in the diet, we're getting a protective effect, some positive impact from that. Then comes along the question where there's more of the confusion is around omega-3 supplementation, because this is one of the areas where we've seen mixed results depending on the context. And this is where kind of nutrition science gets a bit iffy, is that there's a number of pieces of nuances here. One is that we're now looking at a supplement compared to diet, and that alone is a different type of intervention to be aware of. Then the second is where we see very positive outcomes for omega-3 supplementation tends to be in specific situations. So, for example, some of the big successes have been in very high dose omega-3 supplements in specific forms that have been used to lower triglycerides. And this has been particularly useful for people who have a number of the trials have been done in what we call secondary prevention. So someone that's already had a heart attack, maybe they've in the past had high levels of blood cholesterol or LDL cholesterol. Oftentimes they might be prescribed a statin, but a number of those people, once their LDL comes down, they still might have high triglycerides. So this is what we call this kind of residual triglyceride, high residual triglycerides. And so one of the ways to lower that can be through this really high dose EPA supplementation, which is what some of these trials have looked at. Now, that is a different product to the typical omega-3 supplement that we're seeing in supermarkets. It's also a very different demographic and population that's specifically in a group of secondary prevention looking at lowering triglycerides, which it can have that effect. We have other trials that have looked at other lower amounts, like 1 gram of omega-3s. Again, they tend to be in specific types, so it's an omega-3 ethyl ester. And again, the headline sometimes is that there was no difference or a null finding for one of the main trials called the VITAL trial. And again, I'll try not to get too deep in the weeds of the nerdy methodology, but in short, the outcome that they looked at is something called a composite outcome, which is 3 different outcomes together. So it was major cardiovascular events, I believe. So it was like a stroke, major cardiovascular events, and cardiovascular mortality. And you have a composite of those together. 2 of those outcomes, there wasn't an effect observed. And so then in general, for that full composite outcome, we didn't see a difference. Hence the kind of headline of no impact. But when you actually look at some of that data, you see that there was pretty strong risk reductions for things like heart attacks, for fatal heart attacks, and then for total coronary heart disease events as well from that consumption. So again, depending on the type of product we're looking at, the type of population, and specifically one of the things that we saw in VITAL was that you see a difference in the outcomes when you look at someone's baseline omega-3 intake. So this is one of the important things, again, in nutrition, because what we see is that people were starting with a very low omega-3 content. So their typical diet had a very low intake of omega-3. Those people, when they were given the supplement, saw a very positive outcome, this risk reduction. For those people who already had a decent amount of omega-3 in the diet, didn't really seem as much of a benefit. So this makes complete sense. So more of that benefit is going to be coming from people whose already intake is low. And this is why we might see differences across populations. So if you look at a lot of Western populations, the typical omega-3 intake in the diet is really low. If you compare that to some other groups, for example, in Scandinavia or in Japan, the baseline or the average intake of omega-3 tends to be higher within the population. And so you would see different outcomes based on supplementation there. So all in all, this is to say that in general, we do see that dietary patterns that have a sufficient amount of omega-3 tend to have positive outcomes for heart health. And then depending on the population, we can have these specific benefits related to cardiovascular disease depending on the type of omega-3 and that population. So that was the kind of first part of the question. If that's
great.
making
So if I can throw one thing in there, so let's give people a really practical takeaway. It's going to be a bit of a generalization, and I mean, salmon or other fish, is there a general guideline of like how many servings that you would suggest people try to consume that correlates with or seems to have strong evidence that this improves health outcomes?
Yeah, so most of the guidelines tend to suggest that in around 2 to 3 servings of rich sources of omega-3. So they tend to be fatty fish. Now, of course, not everyone consumes those. It is possible to get omega-3 from some plant sources, for example, chia seeds being one. However, it is in a different form. And again, this is another rabbit hole that we could get into, but it's in a form ALA and gets converted later on. But that conversion can be relatively low. And so there are some concerns that people have of that we don't have this direct source of one of those omega-3s, DHA, because getting that from a conversion from ALA can be relatively small and sometimes not at all. For that reason, some people choose to maybe consume a vegan-friendly omega-3 supplement. That would be a direct source of DHA that can be get from things like algae, for example. So those are potential options. The total amount ends up being a suggested combined 250 milligrams per day is the adequate intake. So there isn't an RDA for the omega-3s like there is for other nutrients. We do have what's called an adequate intake, which is kind of a general suggestion. And basically the idea is we don't have strong enough evidence to get to the point of an RDA, but we can kind of give this number that tends to be useful. And so that the kind of pragmatic thing is a couple of servings of direct sources of omega-3 per week, if possible. And if someone is not going to do that, then it may be prudent to either really plan out their diet well, if let's say a plant exclusive diet, to make sure they're getting plenty of those sources, or if they're going to supplement, to be using one that kind of fits in with whatever type of dietary pattern they're following.
And this episode is brought to you by Macros First. I've always struggled with nutrition tracking apps, even the slightest hassle or friction, and it breaks my habit. That changed with Macros First. When I tried it, I told my friend, the founder, Jacob, quote, this is, well, let's just call it a certain other app on steroids. It's the easiest app to use, and it has a free barcode scanner, which if you use tracking apps, you know this is a really big deal. I recommend Macros First to all my clients and friends, and even had them sponsor my 2024 conference. Here's an example feature I love, auto-calculate food portions. Let's say you've got 30 grams of protein left for the day and you're thinking, how much chicken breast do I need to hit that? In other apps, you're left guessing serving sizes, hoping you get close to your 30-gram goal. With Macros First, just tell it the target you want to hit and it tells you exactly how much to eat. No more macro Tetris. Other apps ask, how much do you eat? Macros First also lets you ask, how much should I eat? And while Macros First's premium version is incredible for any user, the basic version, which is nowhere near basic, is free to use. So you can go to either the Apple Store or Google Play to download. I'm not sure which order the episodes will air, but I have also recently recorded with my friend Melody Schoenfeld, and we went quite deep into plant-based vegan nutrition. So what you just said there will complement that episode really well. If someone's interested in a lot more of that, great episode. I also have a slightly older episode with Dr. Matthew Nagra. It's fantastic. Great. So I'll let you dive even further to the second part of that question.
So on the omega-6, some of the things that we had mentioned earlier is, as you outline, there has been suggestions that this is pro-inflammatory, and that's the problem with having a high amount of omega-6. Oh. And built into that is also, people say it's also the omega-6 to 3 ratio. So we have this really, if you consume too much omega-6 in your diet, this is causing a problem because of this really high ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. And our ancestors would have had something that's more comparable to 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, and now we have something completely out of whack with that. So one of the things that I already mentioned is that when you actually go and look at controlled trials where you give people more omega-6, one of those being, for example, linoleic acid, we don't see that's inherently pro-inflammatory. So you go human controlled trials, you measure markers of inflammation, CRP, interleukin-6, TNF-alpha, all these different markers, and you don't see meaningful differences that crop up when you do that. So that is first part of it. The second is that mechanistic uh, line of reasoning kind of falls apart because we have inbuilt regulation of how much of that conversion of linoleic acid to arachidonic acid happens. And so that takes out one of the potential worries that people might have of why it would be inflammatory. Once we build on top of that, we can then again take it even a step back further to into more pragmatism and think about what are the types of foods that contain omega-6s. What happens when we consume more of them in the diet? So high amounts of omega-6 or polyunsaturated fats more broadly tend to be a lot of the plant sources or fat sources that come from plant origin. And when you look at dietary patterns that consume more of those foods in general, we see positive health outcomes. Some of those may relate to things we've already talked about. So having more polyunsaturated fat and less saturated fat improves someone's blood lipids, and that's going to have a positive impact there. And also a lot of those food choices have other nutrients that are probably going to play an important role. Then probably one of the things that gets missing from the discussion around this omega-6 to 3 ratio is that when we do see these associations with negative health outcomes, it's probably more of just an indication that someone has a low intake of omega-3, because we have a really clear and consistent evidence base that a lot of people underconsume omega-3. Their omega-3 status is pretty low. And so that in itself is going to be driving a problem. If someone's getting plenty of omega-3 within their diet and have a good omega-3 status, then the idea that consuming a decent amount of omega-6 fatty acids is going to be problematic doesn't fit with the best evidence that we have. And so it's probably more a function of worrying about the wrong side of that equation, as opposed to just thinking, let's make sure we're getting enough omega-3 and an overall healthy dietary pattern, as opposed to kind of micromanaging the specific amount of omega-6 fatty acids that are coming into the diet.
So the ratio really isn't all that important, if at all.
No, it doesn't seem to be predictive of anything that we can't say beyond a certain point that this is doing anything. There is some piece of nuance to this. So you will see, like I mentioned earlier, that there can be some competition between omega-6 and omega-3. But the amount someone would have to be consuming at any one time to make a dent to do anything to their omega-3 index would have to be incredibly high. And then more broadly, like I said, when it comes down to the typical dietary patterns that are being advised that would include these types of foods, it's just not going to be a potential issue. No one is going out and saying, drink a liter or a gallon of sunflower oil in one sitting. So when you have it in the typical amounts of the typical food products we're talking about here, it's not, there's no reason to suspect we're seeing some type of negative impact on inflammation, because we just don't see this in any of that human data.
One last practical point. I've heard claims that farmed salmon has higher amounts of omega-6 versus omega-3 versus fresh salmon. Is there anything to this? Does it matter? Is farmed salmon or other fish just as healthy to consume?
I've seen conflicting data on this, and it seems to be dependent on the study and where it's looking at. Obviously, a large component of this depends on what is being fed specifically to those salmon on that particular farm and so on. And then there's other people that will point to some of the benefits of doing that. Given the practicalities of this and the slight differences in potential nutrients here, there's not enough for me to make a suggestion that I would go and recommend someone that they would need to only consume wild caught salmon, for example. I think that ends up being very cost prohibitive for a lot of people, for almost no real nutritional benefit per se. And it's again one of these areas where we might be able to note slight differences, again, depending on the study that's being looked at. But relatively in the grand scheme of things, nothing that would be enough of a difference to have a meaningful health impact, but could be a significant barrier to a lot of people to consuming a food that they might otherwise would have that could have a health benefit. So I would have to, again, look at more of the specific comparisons, because it's been quite a while since I've looked at that. But as far as I know, the differences, if any, tend to be dependent on the study, can change from study to study. and don't tend to be that practically meaningful from what I recall. But I do stand to be corrected on that particular point.
At least for now, it's probably way better for people to consume more salmon, even if it's farmed, than to worry about these things. Gotcha. This has been fantastic. Okay. With a little bit of time we have left, I hope you can give a good treatment to, how can we lower LDL cholesterol? That being prefaced by the fact that we have pretty strong evidence that high LDL cholesterol, or as you said, ApoB, is going to have a pretty high risk for worsening cardiovascular health. But maybe also within the lens of, we definitely have some popular figures in what I call pseudo nutrition claim that high LDL cholesterol isn't at all a risk factor. Do you want to tackle that?
Sure. I mean, this is one that's a huge, huge area. If people do want to dive into this, we've had to spend hours on a series of episodes we've done on this, as well as
Please.
several deep articles, but people can consult those. But in general, the best way to think about this is that there's very hard to find as something as consistent and strong in terms of the evidence we have in the medical field around the role of elevated LDL cholesterol across someone's life course and risk of atherosclerosis or atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So we know that a high burden of these ApoB containing lipoproteins, which is maybe the most specific marker we can talk about. But in general, when people are getting a lipid panel, they're probably more likely going to get an LDL cholesterol number. But that in and of itself, if you have a high level of LDL cholesterol across a long time course, because it's an cumulative exposure to this. So it's not just the amount that you have at any one time, it's the cumulative exposure over decades is what is driving atherosclerosis. This is a causal risk factor, meaning that if you have this high burden of LDL cholesterol for high enough and for long enough, that is causally driving atherosclerosis. This is across multiple different lines of evidence, whether you want to take from it being biologically plausible to the mechanisms we have, to looking at specific cases of like, say, different genetic cases. So we have something like familial hypercholesterolemia, where people are born with really, really high cholesterol that stays high. When you look at different genetic types of studies called Mendelian randomization, where you can kind of predict this from based on genetics, where you look at any lipid lowering interventions through statin drugs or other medications. All these lines of evidence converge together to show that the lower you get that LDL cholesterol, reduces that risk, reduces the atherosclerotic development, and then therefore is stopping people having cardiovascular related events. And so this is incredibly clear across multiple lines of different evidence. And again, it's just become a strange thing that is, again, embedded with a whole host of different narratives that we're going to deny that high LDL cholesterol is a problem, because with that, then it feeds into other types of narratives and ideologies, i.e., certain types of diets that have lots of saturated fat and are going to increase someone's LDL cholesterol. The way I can stay consistent with this ideology is also by telling myself that high LDL cholesterol isn't a problem. Or if I have bought into an ideology around that statin drugs are just there as a way to try and kill us and they're really damaging to humans, then of course I'm going to say they were just invented for a problem that doesn't really exist. So we know that this high degrees of LDL cholesterol over the life course has a cumulative effect, drives atherosclerosis, and is causal in that. This is undeniable from a kind of the amount of data we have at this time point. Where this connects then to diet is, like we say, there's various factors that can influence LDL cholesterol, including genetics and others. But from a dietary perspective, the main thing that we would look at, in addition to someone's overall total energy intake, is that kind of P to S ratio. So how much saturated fat is someone consuming? How much polyunsaturated fat? And then is that the thing that is driving their LDL cholesterol high? Or if we're trying to go to lipid lowering, there's a number of different things we can do to try and get someone's LDL cholesterol lower. And we can go through those if you wish. But from a kind of broad perspective, we know that's the kind of problem with having a high LDL cholesterol.
Any brief but specific recommendations that someone can take away if they want to make some changes, if they're concerned or they've got, let's say, themselves or family members where their LDL ApoB is high?
Sure. So there's a few things. First is, let's start with their overall dietary pattern, i.e., can we get it generally in line with typical healthy eating recommendations that people would recommend? So getting plenty of fruits and vegetables within their diet, getting enough dietary fiber. Fiber is a great one that can have a benefit here. So starting from a place of, can we get generally healthy foods within the diet? Then the next point of attack would be to look at sources of saturated fat we might have in the diet. So this would be coming from lots of fatty cuts of meat, maybe lots of butter, maybe they're using certain things to cook in that have high amounts of saturated fat, or maybe they're consuming lots of pastries or chocolates or things that are going to have a high amount of saturated fat. Can we start removing those sources and making changes for foods that don't have a high amount of saturated fat, and instead replace it with other types of foods and therefore other types of nutrients? So we're aiming to bring down the total amount of saturated fat someone is consuming. Like I said, to get the greatest degree of that lipid lowering, we might say, to replace some of that saturated fat or those sources I'm taking out, I'm going to replace it with some unsaturated fats, and maybe a good amount of that being polyunsaturated fats. A simple way to think of that would be to some of the plant sources of fats. So maybe nuts and seeds and avocados. They can be including olive oil or salmon, like all these things that we've mentioned already.
Or seed oils. Or seed oils. Oh my God.
If they wish to take that step, that would be, again, they can start doing this with their types of cooking oils, what they're adding to salads, all these types of things. So reducing that burden. Those things alone, if they're bringing down that saturated fat content, should be making a real dent in that. There's a variation here depending from person to person, but that can have some effect. Then we know there's some other specific things that people can look into. One is called the portfolio diet. This was developed by David Jenkins. This has some very specific components to it. There was 4 pillars, now there's 5. People can look this up, but it's the inclusion of nuts, soy protein, viscous fibers. So these would be in certain types of things, like oats would be one. People might have heard that recommendation from maybe their doctor and so on, including some oatmeal as a breakfast, because the beta glucans that are in oats would be one of these types of viscous fibers. So there's a number of these different components that make up this portfolio diet that, when you layer it on top of the already typical recommendations we would give someone, can further reduce LDL cholesterol. And it's really simple. There's a kind of short list with examples. People can look this up. It was developed by David Jenkins up in Toronto. That would be next layer. And then one of the most important things is, if their LDL cholesterol is still staying high despite their dietary change, and maybe they're the person that did want to do it all through lifestyle, but if it's not changing, just talk to their doctor and talk about their options through medication, because there's incredible options now, incredibly effective. Their doctor can go through all of that. And people might have worries or know someone who had maybe certain side effects to a certain medication. These are all known about now, and any competent physician will be able to say, okay, we will trial this one. And if there's any effects, there's loads of different options they can do. Many of them do combination therapy now, incredibly safe profiles. And if you get the LDL cholesterol down with that is having a measurable, huge risk reduction for your cardiovascular disease risk. And so those would be the things to do from a dietary perspective. And then beyond that, to have a conversation with their doctor, aiming to get the LDL cholesterol, or more specifically, their ApoB, as low as they foreseeably can, given their circumstances and their interest in how far they want to go with that.
Bloody fantastic. Everybody can deeper dive on some of the stuff you are into, especially if they really love this deep evidence-based nutrition, via your podcast, Sigma Nutrition Radio. They can follow you at DannyLennon_Sigma. Is there anywhere else you want to send people?
No, those would be the primary places. If they're specifically into some of these things, there's a couple of long form articles, if they like reading, that are on the website that might be a good place to send them. One is all about seed oils, that goes through everything in detail. It's written out, has some of the data and the graphs, and linked to that there. And then we have a 3-part series on all the things related to blood lipids, saturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, LDL. All of that's in a 3-part written series. So those, I'll give you the links to them if people want to read stuff. If they prefer podcasts, then they can check out the podcast and look through our archive, or I'm also happy to recommend to you specific episodes that might be more related to what we talked about today. But yeah, they would be the places, and they can have a look and see if anything's of interest.
Absolutely fantastic. Anybody listening, obviously, if you're listening here to the end, you found this valuable. Save this one as a resource, because you're going to have people in your world. Now, they're going to be the people that online are very loud, anti-seed oil. They're going to listen to this. They're going to lose their shit. They won't even give it a shit. But they're going to be the vulnerable people in your world that are hearing the bullshit from these people. Give this episode to those people, okay? Give them the evidence. Hopefully that will help steer them. Thank you, Danny. It's always a pleasure. This has been fantastic. And everybody else, thanks for tuning in. I appreciate all you guys.
Thank you.